Richard Horton probably needs no introduction. Richard is the editor of The Lancet. And Richard's a person who, in a sense, has, I think, made The Lancet so accessible to so many, and also encouraged a lot of us to think about the global impacts, think about how we bring our work and make our work real, and turn our research work into action, so that there is a purpose, so that we're not in a situation where there's just words without action. So Richard, without any further ado, thank you for being here, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liz. Thank you. Haven't said anything yet. For those of you who actually read the Planetary Health Commission report, you'll remember that there were 3 challenges at the end of that: imagination, knowledge, and action. And this is the first time I've been in this rather incredible temple of knowledge. And imagination, experience, perseverance, and intelligence. So the University of Edinburgh got there before we did in its envisioning of the challenges that face us. My hotel room, which is just a minute's walk away from here, has 4 books on the shelf in the room that I'm staying in. The first is 50 Places to Play Golf Before You Die, Scotland's 100 Best Walks, The Making of Classical Edinburgh, and then the 4th book on the shelf, the one that I picked out, was Watersheds in Marxist Ecofeminism by Pamela Odie. Now, this book is about the geopolitics of water, the geographies of river conservation, and the idea of ecological time. The definition that Pamela Odie gives to that is the time it takes to restore the effects of human activity, the time cycle of renewal and replenishment within the ecosystem. It must be surely of immense significance and hope that a hotel now regards planetary health as a sufficiently important movement as to require that it stocks planetary health texts. So I felt very optimistic about that, in addition to seeing these endorsements by the university. And there's another piece of good news I wish to be the purveyor of. Nick Watts, who's here in the audience, yesterday informed me that, Nick, where are you? Stand up. Where are you, Nick? Stand up, stand up, stand up. Because Nick informed me that the Wellcome Trust, in its wisdom, has awarded £5.5 million over the next 5 years to support the Lancet Countdown on Climate and Health. Congratulations, Nick! That's a real achievement. I just have 3 brief reflections. Writing in the 3rd volume of his Treatise of Human Nature in 1740, the Edinburgh philosopher David Hume grappled with the idea of justice. What was justice? Hume was a skeptic, and he resisted the prevailing rationalism of the time, whether it was theological or secular. The belief that abstract reason was the path to truth and therefore a guide to life. No. The only reliance that any of us could place on anything is our experience or custom, argued Hume. He wanted to be to morality what Isaac Newton was to mechanics. Hume denied that there were somehow natural and essential differences between right and wrong, good and evil, and justice and injustice. Now, when he published his treatise, his arguments were either ignored or fiercely rejected. He was alleged to have denied the immutability of truth. He was a venal man who condoned vice, and he had evil, anti-religious intentions. But justice and morality, Hume argued, were, in his words, not conclusions of our reason. Good and evil were the actions of the mind and are derived from our situation. And those actions depend upon our passions, our motives, our volitions, and our thoughts. Justice for Hume is, again I quote, an artifice or contrivance which arises from the circumstances and necessity of mankind. Just think about that for a moment. Justice is an artificial convention. He wrote, "There is no real or universal motive for observing the laws of equity. Justice is not a natural virtue." In other words, we can choose. We can choose what justice means to each one of us. It's up to us. For Hume, justice existed through a constant tacking between human selfishness and human sympathy, what he later called the principle of humanity. Without the human invention of justice, our communities would revert to the state of nature, an imagined pre-society of violence, conflict, and war. Without justice, Hume wrote, society must immediately dissolve, and everyone must fall into that savage and solitary condition which is infinitely worse than the worst situation that can possibly be proposed in society. If it is true that justice establishes itself by a kind of convention or agreement, then today we must surely conclude that we have the liberty to choose what we mean by justice, to tack between selfishness and sympathy, to reconceive the kind of world that we wish to live in. That might feel like an awesome responsibility, but it is also a revolutionary emancipation. And it is right that we feel that radical liberty to choose here in Edinburgh. Reflection number 2. Everyone in this room knows that we are meeting at a perilous time. In his book, How Will Capitalism End?, Wolfgang Streeck writes about what he calls the multi-morbidities facing capitalism today. He identifies a coalescence of frailties, an exhausted armamentarium of remedies. He points to the decline of a US-dominated world order, political crises facing so many nations, the weakening of democracies, social fracture, ecological pressure. Now, whether you believe that this is the final gasp of capitalism or merely another hurdle that capitalism will negotiate, Streeck argues, and I think this is not to be resisted, he argues that capitalism is certainly passing through a period of uncertainty at least. He concludes that this doubt about the future tells us something important, which is that our orthodox economic and social theories have lost much of their predictive power. We are unmoored today. The sky above us is dark. There is no North Star, no sextant, no compass, no radio, radar, or satellite, no map to navigate. So what should we do with our radical freedom in this moment of desolate indeterminacy? Even if you don't subscribe to Streeck's bleak vision, there is strong evidence that something has gone badly wrong. Writing in Science last year, a group of Harvard economists mourned the end of the American dream, the idea that one's children could expect to do better, to have a higher standard of living than one's parents. But it's not just the loss of the American dream, it's the loss of the Scottish dream, the Welsh dream, the Irish dream, the English dream, the French, Spanish, Italian. Those dreams have slowly been corroded. But why? Why have they? because of the greater inequality in the distribution of the benefits of economic growth today. If we are to revive the dream of intergenerational progress, economic growth will simply not be enough. Addressing inequalities must be the first task for governments. But unfortunately today, we see no government heading or heeding that message. The collapse of opportunity and hope manifests itself, as we know, in adverse health outcomes. From rising mortality among white non-Hispanic Americans in especially economically bleak parts of the United States, to the sub-citizenship that afflicts victims of austerity and exclusion, the embodied outcomes, so to speak, of the political choices we allow our governments to make. Indeed, it was a former International Monetary Fund economist, Ken Rogoff, who wrote over a decade ago, "The next great battle between socialism and capitalism will be waged over human health and life expectancy." If health is the theater of conflict for contemporary politics, then we should interrogate the idea of health a little more closely, because the idea of health also applies to the state of our political economy. Let me take just one example. Health systems require investments. A damaged economy will jeopardize those investments. So what do we know about the economic damage that will accrue by not meeting the Paris climate targets? Marshall Burke and his colleagues at Stanford recently, just a few weeks ago, reported that 90% of the world's population had a 75% chance of reduced economic damage if the 1.5 degrees Celsius target was met. And poorer nations will benefit the most. Turn that around and say it a slightly different way. If the world sees a 2.5 to 3 degrees Celsius warming by the end of the century, which is a much more likely scenario, global GDP will fall by as much as 25% of what might have been expected. Our failure to act on climate will have a direct impact on our economic security, which will have a direct impact on our prospects for health. Or take our sense of the extent to which human societies, the human species, has been changing the biosphere of our planet. We seem to have settled on the Anthropocene, lying somewhere between the Industrial Revolution and the Trinity atomic test in 1945. And the period since 1945 to 50, we have labeled the Great Acceleration. The problem with this story of human influence on the planet, and the biosphere especially, is that it is just plain wrong. There's an interesting correlation to observe. Since the late Quaternary, a period of about 0.5 to 1 million years ago, the number and diversity of large mammals in the world has declined dramatically. Those size-selective extinctions were underway over 100,000 years ago on every continent of our planet. And their precise correlation with the expansion of hominins, our ancestors, implicates us as a species, as a central force in reshaping the Earth's biosphere. Much, much, much earlier than we care to recognize or emphasize today. And this trend will continue over the next 2 centuries. The largest mammal that we can expect on Earth by 2200 is the domestic cow. So my argument is simply this: that we have severely underestimated the impact of our species on the biosphere of our planet over time. We have severely underestimated the severity of the existential predicaments that we face today, and that we have failed to seize the opportunity to connect these macro trends to the immediate and politically mobilizing prospects for human health. Let me turn to a final reflection, the one that in some ways concerns me the most. We should celebrate the capacious, interdisciplinary definition of planetary health that this conference represents. But I worry that its realization is not capacious or interdisciplinary enough. Planetary health is not, I hope, going to evolve into a recalibrated version of environmental health, an environmental health 2.0, so to speak. At least to me, planetary health is an inquiry into our total world, the unity of all life and the forces that shape those lives. Our political systems, and to use Dambia Moyo's word, the headwinds affecting those systems, the failure of technocratic liberalism, and the populism, xenophobia, racism, and nationalism that it has left in its wake, the intensification of market capitalism, the triumph of neoliberalism, and the state's willingness to sweep away every obstacle to markets, where power resides in society, and the continuous struggle for power among competing interests, the intimate and the intricate effects of wealth on the institutions of the state, the inability of mobility to compensate for inequality, the decay of tolerant, pluralistic, well-informed public discourse, the critical importance of taking an intersectional perspective on our predicaments, the meaning of the rule of law, the role of elites, the origins of the war and the pursuit of peace, the problems of economics and of economists, the study of nations, their histories, their geographies, ideas and beliefs, and how we live together amid this chaos. In his most recent book, Global Discontents, Noam Chomsky writes that the efforts that go into trying to ensure the end of humanity are impressive. 200 years after the birth of Karl Marx, who still teaches us the importance of analyzing and critiquing society as a whole. 50 years after Paris in 1968, which signaled that the modern state was not as impregnable as we thought it was. My plea is to make planetary health the response to Hume's principle of humanity, to make planetary health the response to Streeck's capitalist multimorbidities, to make planetary health the response to Marx's invitation to analyze and critique total society, to make planetary health the response to a defense of the principle, the impulse underpinning Paris in '68, to make planetary health the response to Chomsky's impressive efforts for self-destruction, to make planetary health about the totality of our existence. In Joseph Roth's 1932 novel, The Radetzky March, which chronicles the extinction of the Habsburg Empire, he writes, "The collapse of the world could already be seen as clearly as one sees a thunderstorm on the edge of a city." And there lies our predicament, to see that thunderstorm on the edge of our cities and our communities. Many prefer to turn their heads away. It falls to you, it falls to us, the emerging planetary health community, to insist that we face that thunderstorm, to take responsibility for our future and its contingencies, and to provide a new foundation for the stability of our universe. That's planetary health. Thank you.
That was extraordinary. I'm going to take the liberty of asking one question, Richard. As we see that thunderstorm and as we take up to prepare and to react and change, what else can we do that we can push the thunderstorm further away? The rainbow came up in every one of these pictures, and the sense that there is actually a huge hope. Give us the hope actions as well.
Hope is not a strategy. We need a strategy. And planetary health is an idea, it's a philosophy, but it has the beginnings of a strategy. It has the beginnings of rewriting the way we do politics, the way we think about our economic systems, the way we want to build our societies, and the way we want to live together. It's at the beginning of a new vision for how we live on our fragile, wounded world. I see planetary health as a personal philosophy. I don't see it as a religion, but I do see it as the beginning of a different way of envisioning our existence, providing the embryo of that strategy for reconceiving our world. Our task, we're a small group, our task is to proselytize and advocate and make people aware of these challenges. And I am an optimist in believing that we have an opportunity that at no point in the history of humankind have we had. An opportunity to end ignorance, to end the darkness that has descended upon our leadership. But it's up to every one of us to recognize that we have those fundamental liberties, as Hume argued, to choose the world we live in. And that's why being here and thinking about that I find very inspiring. So Liz, wherever you are, there you are. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Richard. It was fantastic. It was wonderful.